Hi everyone, Stefan back again with another LaserDisc review. Today I want to talk about Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which I recently picked up and watched for the first time on LaserDisc. I have this on other forms and I've watched it many times over the years, but I'm very happy to have this on LaserDisc. It's a phenomenal release. It sounds incredible. It's probably the best sounding release I have so far in my collection. And it's probably one of the better ones out there. I just really think it was handled so well on LaserDisc and just sounds incredible, and it looks fantastic too. It's one of the better, probably not the best overall, but one of the better looking discs in my collection, and again, one of the better, the best sounding overall. So it's one of my favorite discs as far as just kind of like a fun showpiece for LaserDisc. It's really interesting and fun to have this in the collection, and the last Star Wars film released on the format. And as far as the film itself, I was very excited to get it because I have very mixed emotions with this movie. On one hand, I really adore this movie, and on the other hand, it's incredibly disappointing, and it represents an era of Star Wars that is very disappointing in many ways for me. And I was the right age to where I grew up watching the original trilogy, but I was also too young to have seen them in theaters. So then going into having a brand new trilogy, and I could re-experience it in theaters, and I was, the right age to where I really wanted my experience with the prequel movies as I was growing up and seeing them in theaters to mirror the experience that older relatives had, or like my parents, or like just other people that were old enough to have seen those movies in theaters. My one aunt is a huge Star Wars fan, has always been a huge fan, and I really wanted the kind of experience she would have had back in the day versus the way I had it in the early 2000s, 1999 for this first one here, and it just was a disappointing experience overall. So like, I have mixed emotions with Episode 1 because of what it represents, but I also really like it in some ways. It's actually my favorite of the three prequel movies, but again, I think some of the worst elements of the entire prequel series are in Episode 1. But some of the best elements, some of my favorite elements, are also in Episode 1. So it's a mix of the best and the worst. And overall, with the other ones, Clone Wars to me is just so forgettable in many ways. It's almost bland, and to say that for a Star Wars movie, that's something. There were lots of things I didn't like about Clone Wars. I really didn't like obviously the romance element was not played off well, and it was so disappointing because it should have been done so much better. There's just so many little elements in that middle chapter, which is usually the most fascinating, interesting, dark chapter, that middle chapter of a trilogy, and that middle section, but it was just so forgettable and disappointing, and the whole Clone Wars element was handled so much better in other sources that it's just a very weak, sagging middle chapter. It just never really clicked with me. And then Episode 3 is my least favorite, though, even more than Clone Wars. Episode 3 might be my least favorite Star Wars movie. I really want to re-watch The Last Jedi, because that's kind of tied with it towards the bottom there. I just really never liked that one because I think in many ways I went into the theater thinking, alright, this is one last chance, blow me away, just like make up for Episode 1 and 2, and it did the opposite for me. In many ways it was just sort of the culmination, the representation of everything that I disliked in Episode 1 and 2, and didn't really bring anything new to the table that I really enjoyed. I think the fall from grace of Anakin and turning to Vader was handled terribly. It really felt like just sort of a middle school level book storytelling to something that could have been far deeper, more intricate, and more interesting, but still presented in a way that was understandable to a wide audience. I think it failed in that respect. And just overall, I really have always hated that movie from the first time I've seen it in theaters. And again, it might be my least favorite. I'm going to rewatch some of the newer ones I've watched since the theaters. But overall though, when it comes down to it, the other elements too that I really like in Episode 1 that were missing in the other ones, when you look at the lightsaber duels, especially in Empire and Jedi, when you go back to that trilogy, is that the one with Obi-Wan and Vader and New Hope is still good, and it sort of represents an evolution of that style, but particularly in Empire and in Jedi, there's so much raw emotion. You really feel that it's truly happening. It doesn't have that choreographed sort of ballet feel that the newer series have, and especially with Episode 2 and 3, I think none of those lightsaber fights had any emotion to me. Even with Anakin and Obi-Wan at the end of Revenge of the Sith, that to me is one of the better ones, but the acting was a little bit better, but overall it just felt overdone and overproduced and so fake. It felt like this choreographed ballet in the midst of a video game. Like, it just didn't have the raw emotion and intensity and the true drama that the older Star Wars films had, and I think that was one of the most disappointing elements. And Episode 1 is a little bit better than that. Still a little bit more of a mixed bag, but I truly felt, and still even rewatching it here on LaserDisc again, I felt so much more excitement and attachment and drama and emotion to the actual lightsaber duels within here, and especially, of course, the very end with Darth Maul and Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan. I still really like that, and I think that was sort of the beginning of moving this new direction of the lightsaber fights. But I think it still held enough of the old elements to where it still really, really works, and I really enjoyed it as a kid. And lots of characters that I really enjoyed here. I really liked Qui-Gon Jinn. I really wish the trilogy had started with a Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan movie, and they didn't meet Anakin until like towards the end of that movie, or in a second one, whatever. I really would have liked to see more Qui-Gon Jinn. I think some of the characters in there were handled very well. Other ones were a disaster. You have, Darth Maul, I think, could have been a fantastic character, and not speaking about, when he gets more into his character in books and things like that later on. Just sticking with Episode 1, he was so underdeveloped and underutilized, and could have been made far more interesting before you get to that final fight, which would have given it so much more meaning. Instead of just a cool baddie to fight, he would have been more of a character that you felt more of a connection to, and would have been more interesting when he kills Qui-Gon Jinn and things like that. So I think that was a bit of a missed mark, and things like the young Anakin, I always thought he was a little bit too young. I think even when I watched it for the first time in theaters, it felt, I never was quite annoyed by him like a lot of other people were. Different elements of him were annoying, and like I hated how he created C-3PO. I thought that was stupid. I think so many instances he just didn't come across as genuine as I wanted him to feel. And even as a kid seeing it, where I was right about his age, I think he's the same age as me. He might even be like a year or two older than me. He's right around the same age as me. No, he'd be a year or two younger than me. And going and see it in theaters, I always felt like it was too much of an obvious ploy to try and attract younger audiences and try and get them to feel like they could be Anakin, they could be that character, but you don't need that. People felt that, even young kids felt that with Luke, and who was much older in the old movies. Even growing up and watching those on VHS for the first time, I felt a connection to Luke and wanting to go on the adventure and being that character. I think you want to emulate someone who's just a little bit older than you when you're that age, and not someone who's the same age, and it didn't quite ring true throughout the first episode. So you have different elements there. I've always thought that I liked the pod racing. It went on too long. I think there should have been some better editing throughout Episode 1, but I think it was an enjoyable idea. There's like just so many different elements of Episode 1 that I enjoyed. It's my favorite musical score out of the three prequel movies. It has some just incredible work done with John Williams, but there's so many different elements here that are great. But then I also like Jar Jar Binks. Like, I feel like Jar Jar is, of course, a horrendous character who almost single-handedly, even when I was a kid, ruins Episode 1. Like, it was supposed to be put in there to attract kids, and as a kid I hated him. But at the same time, he's the worst part of Episode 1 as far as he diminishes his role over time through the next two movies. So Episode 1 has some of those horrible elements, but then again has those elements that I really like, and it's more memorable. And there are aspects of Episode 1 that I think are visually more appealing in some ways. It also feels a little disjointed in other ways, and it also began the look of the trilogy, which I hate, where everything is just, it's far too sleek, everything is far too clean and shiny, and it looks so fake. It doesn't feel real. It's kind of when Lucas started messing with the older Star Wars movies, and part of why I really dislike them, not just because I don't like very much when art changes, when it goes back and you re-edit something. That's not always a good thing, and I think very many times it loses so much of what really made it magical in that way. But I think part of it was when you look at the special effects from either the 70s or 80s, depending on which movie you're watching, those older real special effects look so much better than any of the CGI crap that's added in. Like, it actually stands out, and it makes the movie have less of a timeless quality, because it feels like, alright, you're throwing in this very dated CGI that you can tell is very obviously just plastered into this film with a very different look. It looks terrible, and that kind of moves into this look too, where everything, it looks too fake. There's nothing gritty and real about it. And this really started that with episode 1. So that thing visually is also terrible. I always thought the droids, I love the idea of the droid army, and it made it very interesting, but they were also unbelievably annoying and corny, and it was too much of an obvious, like, kid-friendly, we can destroy a million of them and no one dies kind of thing. Just there's so much of that was such a mixed bag, and everything, I have just these elements of it that I love and other ones that I hate, but it's my favorite overall, I think, partially because of the experience. Even though when I first saw it, it was still a bit of a letdown in theaters. It didn't really matter to me. I was seeing a Star Wars film in the theaters for the first time. You know, it was the end of the millennium, like, it was going to middle school, so it was like a big deal, all this, and going to see it, and it's one of the few times that my dad went with us to the theaters. I saw it for the first time with him, and he didn't take me to too many movies over the years. It was more usually my mom when I was really little. So this was just a very big experience at watching this. And then that following Christmas was pretty much, and my wife said the same thing, for her it was like just Star Wars Episode 1 Christmas. Everyone gave you Star Wars figures, everyone gave you Star Wars, coloring books, and just stickers and whatever. It was all just like, there was like Star Wars Episode 1 Christmas that year. That's all it was. So it was such a huge memory. The whole second half of 1999 for me was Star Wars Episode 1. Even though there were disappointing elements, I didn't even care at the time, because what I liked was there and was great, and the experience of it and the memories that it created, it just made me fall in love with this deeply flawed movie that started, in many ways, the downfall of what Star Wars would become. But it's one that I have very mixed emotions with, and it's one that I think it can be a good movie in some respects. It has good elements to it, it has bad elements to it, and I think it's more of the disappointment in direct comparison to the lightning in a bottle of the original trilogy, and I think it's the legacy that it's left that also leaves more of a negative impression of the movie rather than the movie itself. And yes, you do have horrible, annoying elements like Jar Jar and the Gungans, but there are a lot of good points to it. It's just a very enjoyable movie that I loved being able to rewatch, and I'm glad I have it on LaserDisc. And it's a film that I'm always going to have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, but I just have such a nostalgic attachment and joy to this film that I'm still going to enjoy watching it for years to come.